Good morning. The 15th session of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues is closing tomorrow. We have 3 distinguished speakers here to brief us on the highlights and outcomes of the 2-week session and the road ahead. First, we have with us Mr. Alvaro Pup, the chair of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. He is Maya Quechi from Guatemala. He is the founder and president of NALEB, an organization focused on promoting multicultural societies and political participation of indigenous peoples. He also headed the Indigenous Electoral Observation Mission in Guatemala, among many other distinguished activities at the local, national, and international level. We also have with us Ms. Joan Carling, an indigenous activist from the Cordillera region of the Philippines. She has been working on indigenous issues from the grassroots to the international level for more than 20 years. Ms. Carling is a member of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues and serves as Secretary General of the Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact. And third, we have Mr. Jacob Bryan Aki, who is a student at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. He currently serves on the board of directors for Peace Child International Hawaii and the Council for Native Hawaiian Advancement. Jacob is attending the Permanent Forum for the first time and has become involved in the Global Indigenous Youth Caucus as a Pacific focal point. Each speaker will make brief remarks and then they will take your questions. And I'd like to begin by calling on Mr. Pop. Sir, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I would like to highlight a session on a very complex topic, a topic that is challenging for the indigenous peoples, for the states, and everyone in the world, the theme of peace, conflict, and resolution. It is understood that indigenous peoples have a life in constant pursuit of peace, no conflict, and a follow-through of the resolutions. We have heard many presentations by the states, indigenous peoples. We have had over 1,000 presentations over the last 2 weeks. We are satisfied with the change that we have commenced as to the methods of work of the the Permanent Forum, which are facilitating the issues of the ability for indigenous peoples to come from different parts of the world to attend the forum. In terms of the strongest topics, I should respect and recognize the women's issue. Women in situations of high violence, it's a reality amongst indigenous peoples, and a constant search for peace, and also ensuring that there is compliance with laws within the states. But violence has been a great topic throughout the last 2 weeks. I should share our deepest concern about the persecution of indigenous leaders that defend their territory, natural resources, and particularly water in every region of the world. Even governments that see the need to establish rules, methods of dialogue with the indigenous peoples to be able to combat this reality. Due to conflict, the need of dialogues in regions of Latin America, such as Colombia, where the participation of indigenous peoples has been requested to be made more solid, but also in conditions of peace and negotiation in Mali, where indigenous peoples are living in difficult, violent situations. Agreements. We have heard the demand of indigenous peoples in the pursuit of enforcement of agreements such as Guatemala, Canada, and Bangladesh, where indigenous peoples are demanding that, in fact, resources and these topics shall be provided for. We also have the topic of youth, childhood, and the women, indigenous women that are affected by wars or the lack of compliance of the rights of the indigenous peoples in many regions of the world. And these increase tremendously due to the conditions of poverty, hunger, and discrimination. I would like to close by saying that we recognize that the proposals that we have started to adopt have particular focus on the concern of the forum in terms of childhood and indigenous women in the world. These are fundamental aspects of any negotiation in any region in the pursuit of resolutions and peace. Therein, the proposal of the plan of this year has been surrounding around justice, eliminating and eradicating the persecution of leaders who have appeared to present their cases for the pursuit of free, prior, and informed consent in the world. Thank you very much for being with us.
Carling, please, you have the floor.
Yes, good morning to everyone. I just wish to present what are the future plans, particularly for next year. If we recall, next year will be the 10th year anniversary of the adoption of the UN Declaration. So it will be a critical year in terms of reviewing what has been achieved, what are the gaps and challenges in the implementation of the UN Declaration for the realization of the rights of indigenous peoples across the globe. So there will be the discussions next year will revolve around how can we further achieve the implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The second is on the Sustainable Development Goals. As we all know, it has been adopted. And in yesterday's discussion on this, it's very clear that a lot of indigenous peoples are still not aware of the Sustainable Development Goals. So there's a need to do outreach and awareness raising of indigenous peoples on this issue, and also to hear back from states, UN agencies, funds and programs on how they are incorporating specific targets and indicators relating to indigenous peoples to ensure that indigenous peoples are not left behind. Because that is the theme of, that's the aim of the SDGs. And if we relate it to the implementation of the MDGs in the past, it was very clear that indigenous peoples were left behind. We were almost invisible because there is no data disaggregation to measure if indeed poverty reduction has been achieved, for example, but also to illustrate and be able for indigenous peoples to also be able to mainstream their perspectives on sustainable development. If we take, for example, the case of poverty alleviation, the 1.25 target as a measurement for poverty is not at all appropriate in the context of indigenous peoples. What is more relevant for indigenous peoples is the target on the ownership, control, and access to lands, territories, and resources. So that's one example. The other one is, like I mentioned, the importance of data disaggregation, because unless there is data disaggregation, we will not be able to measure any progress in terms of achieving sustainable development for indigenous people. So this is a critical element that we hope states, UN agencies, funds, and programs will undertake in their work on the SDGs. The third is on the SWAP, or the System-Wide Action Plan for the Realization of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. This is again recently adopted, and thereby we're moving for its implementation. So the clear actions there that needs to be further discussed are how UN agencies, funds, and programs are supporting national legislative actions for the inclusion of the UN Declaration in national laws and policies. Also, on how they will mainstream indigenous people's rights across the UN system, because this is one of the action points within the SWAP. And then also the third point is on how partnerships and collaboration with indigenous peoples will be achieved to ensure that there is a close collaboration and solidarity in moving forwards for the realization of the rights of indigenous peoples. Thank you.
For me, this is my first time attending the forum, and I want to offer a youth perspective on everything that's been going on. From day one, I was heavily involved in the youth caucus, and for me, that caucus it's really an amazing group of people. We come from all parts of this world here for these 2 weeks with one goal, and that's to better the lives of our peoples. For me, I'm only 21 and I'm entering my last year of college, and to engage with leaders, scholars, to learn what's going on in different parts of the world is truly an amazing opportunity. But for me, for the youth, we come here, we learn, and the work doesn't stop. The 2 weeks we have here sets us up for the rest of the year to go back home, to work with our family, to work with our communities, to take the opportunities that we've had here and to take it to those who did not have the opportunity. We're here amongst scholars, amongst leaders who have great ideas on how to improve the conditions of our people, and these are important messages that need to be heard. More importantly, these messages need to be heard from the voices of youth, because we are the next generation of leaders, the next generation of scholars, and it's very important for us to engage on this international level, because in 10, 20 years, we are going to be thrusted into these leadership roles, and, this is preparation to lead, preparation to learn, preparation to learn how to make this world a better place for our people. And this is just a great opportunity, and over these past 2 weeks I've had the great opportunity to engage with leaders, and for me this is just the start. I leave Friday. Saturday morning I'm already getting ready for next year, because for us the work doesn't stop. It's a ongoing process, and if we truly want to make this place better for our people, we're gonna have to dedicate our lives to improving these conditions. So I just want to thank you guys for this opportunity, and thank you to the Mr. Chair and the rest of the members, because for us youth, we're the future and we need to get ready for it. So thank you.
Yes, please.
Thank you
Please
very much. My question is for Mr. Chair, so I will do it in Spanish. Quisiera saber, o sea, ¿qué es?
I would like to know what is the expected final outcome of this permanent forum in terms of a document that includes recommendations. In terms of violence, I would like to again ask the same question that I asked before. Are you expecting to include some sort of complaint or demands over the murder of Berta Cáceres and the Mexican students? Thank you.
Efectivamente, tenemos muchas preocupaciones por el tema de la violencia. Vamos a tener un cuerpo de recomendaciones que incluyen toda la violencia que sufren los pueblos indígenas, incluyendo la ampliación de investigaciones y justicia en esos casos, como muchos otros en el mundo.
Many other cases in the world. What I would say is that the document will contain 3 recommendations that are very significant as a result of the work that we have done. The first of them is that we have a strong call to the states for the pursuit of peace and resolutions in moments of conflict. Second, we're inviting the states to develop evaluations of the compliance of the declaration upon the 10th year of anniversary of the declaration. Third, we are asking formally or inviting for an indigenous woman to be part of the Security Council. This is an invitation. It demonstrates creativity in pursuit of answers that might include greater participation for indigenous women. And to respond to the topic of recommendations, in fact, the recommendations themselves are a compilation of the concerns of many people. Some of the most intense fora were held because of the pursuit of this change. And I'm very nostalgic because so many people came from so many parts of the world and were not able to be given the floor because there's great concern, great pain over indigenous peoples, and we just didn't have the time to hear them all out. I believe that the work of the advisors, the president of the General Assembly, to find new methodologies, better methodologies for the participation of indigenous peoples, that must recognize that these thousands of people that come throughout the years don't have the opportunity to send their most significant messages. We have also recognized the effort made by community TV and radio that, against all odds, they are making themselves present and saying, we want to help and contribute in the communication. The Communication Indigenous Caucus enrollment, I believe, is very important in this session.
Yeah, and maybe just to add on that, there are 2 points that we have, particularly on the missing students in Mexico. One is raising our serious concern over this long overdue issue of justice, calling the attention of the government of Mexico. And second is a recommendation for the special rapporteur to visit Mexico and conduct investigation and contribute in finding means to resolve this problem. So these are the 2 concrete recommendations that we're putting in our report. On the case of Berta Cáceres, we also joined the condemnation for what has happened, and as Alvaro has mentioned, these kind of cases committed against indigenous human rights defenders must be stopped. So we're calling on the states to take measures to prevent impunity. And this includes the country of Honduras, where we all know there's so many political killings taking place with impunity.
Matthew Lee, Inner City Press, on behalf of the Free UN Coalition for Access. Thanks a lot for the briefing. I wanted to ask about something that was being discussed yesterday, and I've seen the draft put out by Finland, Ghana, and Mr. Anaya about participation going forward of indigenous people at the UN on issues that affect them. Where does it stand? My understanding is that some people were proposing kind of almost observer status. Some people are saying it's not, indigenous people are not NGOs and shouldn't be confined to that status. And I heard some states saying, you're not states and we should be running the show. So what is there a consensus position among the forum of what the status indigenous people should have on a day-to-day basis, not only during the forum but during the rest of the year? And if so, what's the process for getting that decided? Thanks a lot.
I would ask my fellow member Joan to discuss the process, but I would like to add that we are within dialogue and consultation, which is the work that the advisors of the President of the General Assembly have proposed, and there are different ideas and different proposals, starting with discussions on the enhancement of regional participation to, in fact, having the status of observers. This will be defined as we develop our work around the topic and the advisors are able to reach a consensus as to their proposal. For now, it would be too premature to say where we're headed. However, I do believe that the closest progress we can make is recognizing presently that the possibility that the indigenous peoples may be able to require or demand that they be observers within the forum. This is something that we need to build a position around this topic.
My colleague has more or less presented where we are now at the forum, but just to mention that since this has part of the WCIP outcome document, where it's clearly the demand of indigenous peoples is to have a new category as observer, because while it's true that we are not state, we are not also NGOs. And if we look at the UN declaration, we have the right to self-determination. And that should be the starting point, that we need to be able to participate in decision-making processes within the UN, to be able to express our specific conditions and our aspirations as peoples. And that deserves the space at the highest level, because that has always been the problem, that since we are not in the decision-making bodies, decisions are being undertaken that actually contravenes the exercise and realization of our rights. So the main aim of this, of the resolution is how to really ensure that effective participation of indigenous peoples is afforded within the UN system. And unless that is done, the issue of conflicts, the issue of injustice will continue, because decisions are being undertaken at the global level where we don't have any participation, and that's the thing that we want to rectify. The other thing is also the point that we are actually contributing to the resolution of conflict. We are actually contributing to sustainable development. We are actually contributing to in the cultural diversity of the world, which benefits everyone. So we have all these contributions. We all have this role, but it is not being recognized, enhanced, and protected. So this is also one thing that we want to be able to express more if we take part in the decision-making body. And as my colleague Alvaro has mentioned, there is a common position among indigenous peoples that a new category that is equivalent to an observer status be created within the UN system as the first step for us to be able to engage more effectively in the UN system. Thank you.
Hello. I'm not sure, my Spanish is a little rusty. Are you proposing to have a woman, an indigenous woman on the Security Council? Was that a proposal?
We do have a proposal around that topic within the dialogue of the expert group, and Joan will share those details with us.
Yeah. The concrete proposal, because we cannot make, unfortunately, we cannot make a recommendation directly to the Security Council. We can only make recommendations through the Economic and Social Council. But what is critical that we find important is in the work of the Security Council in relation to peace and conflict, that the specific situation, distinct situation of indigenous women should be addressed by the Security Council. And one of the means to do this is through the engagement of UN women by submitting reports that becomes part of the process in the work of the Security Council. Because unless we make indigenous women visible in the discussion of peace, conflict, and resolution within the Security Council, their specific concerns will not also be addressed. So that's, I mean, given the internal procedures within the UN, that's how far we can go, I think.
Okay, so I misheard. It's not a proposal to have an indigenous woman with a seat on the Security Council. It's to work through UN Women to try to bring the issues of
The indigenous women issues.
Right.
Yeah.
And what about indigenous men?
Of course, I mean, I think this is not being biased to men, but more importantly, because there is a specific dimension of the impacts of conflict to indigenous women, which is disproportionate to men, and that is not being put on the table. So that is the one that we want to be further discussed and given attention to.
Yes, can you tell us what those specific concerns are relating to women? Because it's probably pretty broad, but more specific would be helpful. Thanks.
We will share the response to this question. And really the concerns of the indigenous women is that they're 3 times more vulnerable as an indigenous woman in any given society in development. First, because of indigenous women's discrimination. Second, due to their rural conditions. And third, due to their conditions in poverty. As a result, what indigenous peoples throughout our discussions within the UN and in many national institutions is that we're promoting and moving the issue of indigenous peoples through indigenous women with much more strength. In fact, this is one of the reasons why we support the possibility that indigenous women might participate at a higher level. There's a historical reason. In the recent years, it's been indigenous women that have headed our processes of fight and reivindication and dialogue. Many of the answers have come from our mothers, from our sisters, and our daughters. And that is a recognition that the Permanent Forum gives this work. Joan.
Yeah. Of course, what's been clearly coming out from the discussions is as Alvaro has mentioned, the issue of vulnerability, which especially in relation to sexual violence, physical assault, rapes, and evidence has already shown that in cases of conflict and militarization, these cases has tremendously increased, particularly in the case of indigenous women because they are more vulnerable as victims. Also, the issue of trafficking has worsened. But what I want to add from the perspective of indigenous peoples is that the role of indigenous women in resource management, in food security, in keeping communities cohesive is seriously undermined by conflicts in their territories. So, because what happens is the communities will suddenly be dispersed because of conflict. Then women will have to think of how to fend for their children, for their family, in a way that if they are intact, then the women come together and work together in addressing this through their collective efforts of resource management and providing food for the community. And this comes along also with the practice of the traditional knowledge. So that means also the continuing practice of traditional knowledge and enhancement of traditional knowledge is also severely impacted by conflicts because they will then be out of their territories. They are disrupted in doing their daily work in relation to resource management. And also the issue of maintaining cohesion of indigenous communities. Women play a key role in keeping the communities together. And in times of conflict, that is again undermined clearly, and that then leads to further the cooperation and solidarity of indigenous communities and villagers are then destroyed. And it will be more difficult for them to cope with the new situation in areas where they are moved, or when they are denied their food, or when they are denied their livelihoods in times of conflict. So this is a major impact of conflict in indigenous women, in addition, of course, to the sexual, physical, but also psychological impacts of these conflicts to indigenous women.
Yeah, just as a follow-up, so where are these conflicts?
Entonces, ¿dónde están sucediendo estos conflictos? ¿Acaso son lugares donde aumenta la violencia en contra de las mujeres indígenas? ¿Podría regionalizar el tema? ¿Y quién define quién es una persona indígena en estos entornos? Gracias.
In the presentations from the floor, that's the strongest presentation.
Una presentación
To the impacts of conflict to indigenous women, because in northeast India, there's a heavy presence of military and at the same time armed groups. They have more than 70 armed groups in that region, and there are more than I think they said 500,000 troops. So you can just imagine the conflict taking place. And they have documented all the cases of rapes, physical assault, trafficking to indigenous women in Northeast India. So probably the statement can be provided to you for all these details in this kind of situation. Now, the second question you have on who defines indigenous peoples, what the international guide that's being followed is that it's basically self-ascription that we define, and that it is affirmed by other indigenous, that we are indigenous, that we maintain a distinct culture and language from the main or say the majority. So that's basically the kind of criteria that defines who indigenous peoples are. And this is very clear if you go to the local level. You can immediately tell the difference between peoples and who are so it's also contextualized and historically based.
Quisiera
to complement what my fellow member has indicated, the first criteria for indigenous people society is that they are peoples that have survived colonization. In fact, now in the Permanent Forum we have identity reivindication, even European identification. Indigenous peoples that recognize themselves as such, that come from Europe and every region of the world. The main criteria is that these are also post-colonization societies. They were native peoples. And part of the identity as I am an indigenous person, the assumption of that identity that lives in a particular identity throughout many centuries of life and cultural practices. And it is a collective decision. Indigenous peoples are marked by collective definitions. The easy skip from I to us allows for the constitution of indigenous peoples.
Guerrero, Mexican News Agency. Are the concerns of some indigenous people about RED being some sort of neo-colonial scheme to take the lands away from them addressed in the outcome document? And Could you expand a bit more on the situation of indigenous people in Mexico regarding access to justice? Thank you.
Throughout certain meetings of the forum in previous years, we have had the same concerns around the topic of lands amongst indigenous peoples. It isn't that they want to take away their lands and territories. There has been a centuries-long logic where they have been murdered and lands have been taken away for the benefit of issues independent to indigenous peoples. And this has been reflected in many recommendations that we have presented to the state. I would sum up the concerns of the Permanent Forum over the last few years is that humanity needs a different logic, a different ethic for the production of wealth. Indigenous peoples live in over 50% of the forests that exist in humanity, and it is human greed that is destroying this forest, and it's the perseverance and constant fight of the indigenous peoples that is preserving it. But as in any system, indigenous peoples are the guardians of life in humanity, and they're called to critical consciousness in new ways of life, but fundamentally in a new ethic to produce wealth. It is something that at the end of the day we're summarizing in the events that are taking place: death, persecution, discrimination. Because of that protection, I should recognize that the position of the states in this permanent forum, in this 15th session, has been one of dialogue. It has been of great participation, and that gives me great hope that the UN can still produce new schemes for human life amongst the indigenous peoples.